Dr. Stephen M. Greer, MD, is founder of the Disclosure Project, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the Orion Project, and Sirius Technology Advanced Research, LLC. Father of the Disclosure Movement, he presided over the groundbreaking National Press Club Disclosure event, May of 2001. Over 20 military, government, intelligence, and corporate witnesses presented compelling testimony regarding the existence of extraterrestrial life forms visiting the planet and the reverse engineering of the energy and propulsion systems of these craft. Over 1 billion people heard of the press conference. That's a lot. Through the original webcast and on subsequent media coverage on BBC, CNN, CNN Worldwide, Voice of America, Pravda, Chinese media, and media outlets throughout Latin America. The webcast had 250,000 people waiting online. Wow. That's the largest webcast in the history of the National Press Club at that time, and that's something. He's worked 17 years to bring together the scientists, inventors, and leaders in society to advance clean new technology energy systems. He is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the strategic process of transforming our carbon-based civilization, type 0, you know we are, to a long-term sustainable civilization using innovative sciences and technology. Dr. Greer is seen and heard by millions worldwide on CBS, the BBC, The Joe Rogan Show, Discovery Channel, and the History Channel. Thrive, and the Ancient Aliens series. Oh, and through many other news sources. So, in other words, he's all over the place. Here, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Stephen Greer. Dr. Greer, hello.
Hello. Glad to be with you again, Art.
Oh, it's great to hear your voice.
Thank you.
And it's great to be on the air again, too.
I agree. It is great to have you on the air again. We've missed you.
Thanks. All right. Now, we've got to keep in mind, Doctor, and so it's going to cause us to switch gears a little bit. There's about, I don't know, something like 27 million Sirius XM listeners. That's really a lot of, that's all.
I know. I'm one of them. I'm one of the subscribers. That's right.
Okay. All right. So they probably have never heard, may never have heard you before. And then, of course, we've got my regulars that have come across who will have heard you. What I'd like to do is kind of split the show in half if we can. Now, you've told me in the past some of the best UFO stories I've ever heard. And so I guess I would challenge you here at the beginning to say, look, if I was a non-believer and I were to ask you to do your best to convince me that UFOs and extraterrestrials are real, what highway would we go down?
Right, exactly. Well, it's the weight of the evidence. And, our website, our new website, which is SiriusDisclosure.com, which is a Sirius, just like Sirius XM, but SiriusDisclosure.com, we have a whole section on evidence, and we're loading up literally dozens of witness testimony from generals, colonels, pilots, astronauts, and so forth, and as well as many government documents that we have obtained dealing with this. And so it's the weight of the evidence, and there's a lot of photographic and video evidence. And what I tell people is that, I just came back from a meeting with 120 world leaders on an island that I really can't discuss much more than that, except to say that this meeting happens every year. Last year, the former director of national intelligence for the United States was there speaking, and 2 years before that, it was Bill and Hillary Clinton. They asked me to come, and I was asked the same thing you just asked, and so I went through some of this material, and I'm happy to do it again. And, one of the things that I always point out to people is that, don't take my word for it per se, but, someone like Professor Hermann Oberth, who was the founder of the space age and was the German rocket expert, he said, and I'm quoting here, he says, "It's my thesis that flying saucers are real and that they are spaceships from another solar system." And he goes on and on and on and on. What you find when you begin to drill down on this is that there's a lot of nonsense and sort of rubbish that I think has been built up around the subject, but at the core of it is a body of evidence that's indisputable by anyone who takes any sort of objective look at it. And President Truman, when they were looking into this during the Truman years and after the so-called Roswell events, he said, and I'm quoting, "I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth." And I'm quoting. And, you know, these are things that aren't in dispute and from people, and when you look at some of the senior military people who've dealt with this, like General Nathan Twining, he was the commander of the Air Material Command that received the materials from this crashed extraterrestrial vehicle at Roswell, and he says, the phenomenon reported is real and not visionary. There are objects approximating the shape of a disc of such appreciable size as to appear as large as a man-made aircraft and larger. There's a possibility that some of the incidents are caused by natural phenomena such as meteors, but the others report characteristics of extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action, which must be considered evasive and on radar, moving in such a way as to lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled either automatically or remotely, and it goes on. And then, the CIA director, one of the early ones, the first one actually, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Now, this is the first CIA director, and it was formed in 1947 after the Roswell event. He says, "It's time for the truth to be brought out. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. I urge immediate congressional action to reduce the dangers from secrecy about unidentified flying objects." Notice he didn't say dangers from the UFOs. It's the dangers from the secrecy, which was sort of echoing what Eisenhower said when he said, look, beware the military-industrial complex because it's gotten out of control. And, in fact, one of the, we had a man who worked with Eisenhower in the White House, in the White House Signal Corps, who's one of our witnesses, who was with Eisenhower when he was talking about how he had been pretty much pushed aside from operational control over some of these programs dealing with UFOs. So, there's an enormous body of evidence. And one of the things that we did when we, in the last 15 years, putting together the Disclosure Project, was to identify people like John Callahan, who was the head of the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration division in charge of looking into accidents and investigations. And many people don't know that this happened, but in the 80s, during the Reagan years, there was a Japan Airlines cargo jet flying the polar route from Paris to Tokyo, and the 747 came up very close to a massive UFO that was larger than a destroyer. In other words, larger than a battleship destroyer. And it was on radar on the 747. It was on ground radar, civilian, and then ultimately also we found out on military radar. The pilot signaled to this ET craft, and it signaled back, and then it began to move in ways that were completely nonlinear. In other words, it'd be...
Can I ask, Doctor, how do you know all this?
Well, for example, John Callahan, whose testimony is on our website at SeriousDisclosure.com. It's there for free for anyone to look at, no charge. He came forward with all the documents and the radar tapes. Now, this is a great story that I've actually never shared with you in the backstory to this. He heard me on, I think it was on Larry King, and he contacted my people and said, look, I'm one of those high government officials that knows about this, but no one's asking the right questions. And so he came forward with the radar tapes and the account of the pilot and the account of the F-16 military interceptors that were sent up, and this over Alaska. And what he told was a fascinating story that he thought when he was investigating this event, which is not in dispute, by the way, that this would blow the lid off the secrecy on this subject. Now, this is back in the 80s. And what happened is that there was a meeting that the head of the FAA called, and there were three people from President Reagan's CIA, three people from the White House Science Technology Group, and then three people from the FBI. And he was there with the admiral who at the time was the head of the FAA. And at the end of this very long meeting, he had boxes and boxes of digital printouts of the radar tapes, the transcripts of the pilot speaking to air traffic control, all the details. And the people from the CIA said, boy, this is one of the best documented cases we've ever seen. He says, and then they said to him, Mr. Callahan, this meeting never happened. And we have never discussed this. And at the end of the meeting, they ordered him to turn over all that material to these people at the CIA. Now, he has said all this publicly now. What they didn't know is that what he had brought to the meeting were copies. And so he gave to me all the originals, and I have them. So, the problem becomes very quickly is sort of what Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who headed up the Air Force kind of cover story operation called Project Blue Book, when he said, it's an embarrassment of riches. There's so much material. We now have about 4,000 cases where these objects have landed and left physical evidence. There are 3,500 cases, like I just described, where there have been military or civilian commercial pilots who have seen them with radar tracings, with often photos and videos. And you think, well, God, there's all this stuff that exists, why isn't it on CNN every night? Or why isn't it on, the major news media? And,
okay,
and that we can
I'll
get
bite
to that
why.
in a moment. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Yeah. You're not going to tell me where the island was, are you?
It was somewhere out in the Pacific, yeah. But anyway, it was an interesting meeting. Now, it's one of these things where I was asked to come and brief these folks, and the other problem, and this is the part that your listeners this is where they're going to see a little bit of shock and awe. And it's, from the time I briefed President Clinton, CIA director, nearly 20 years ago to today, what I have found consistently is that there are two tracks inside these government programs. One is the ordinary track that deals with things like Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and nuclear weapons. Then there's a parallel track, that's the so-called black projects or unacknowledged track. And just because someone is the Secretary of Defense or the CIA director doesn't mean that they're being pulled into and briefed on this other track. It's highly compartmentalized. And so at this meeting, what happened, and this is just I just got back about 3 weeks ago, what I found is that there were people there from, senior government circles, from MIT, from ministries of defense, and it was 120 very high-ranking people from around the world. Virtually none of them knew about this. A couple did. And these were all people that if people out there in the conspiracy world would think that every single one of these people would have been on the inside and in the know. But the way the system runs is that it's so compartmented, it doesn't really matter what your clearance is. Top secret clearances, there are 985,000 people in America with top secret clearances. That and $1.50 gets you on the metro in D.C. But the reality is that the compartmented projects that deal with this are in a different level. And this is why, when I was first approached by the liaison from Clinton CIA director to me, I got this letter, and I have it in my archive to prove this, and excerpts of it are up on our website, where he says, you're going to be the first person to brief the CIA director and the White House on this, because they've made inquiries and they're being denied any information. Now, when I got that letter, it was FedEx, actually, I said, this is the biggest bunch of bull I've ever heard. And I didn't believe a word of it. And so I went into this meeting. My wife and I both went up to Washington for the meeting. I said, this I don't believe. By the end of this 3-hour meeting, I came to understand that, in fact, there are very high-level people who are being left out of this information. And that began to happen in the 50s and 60s, is what Eisenhower was warning us about. So that in 2013, the system is so, frankly, dysfunctional that it beggars the imagination even to wrap your mind around how labyrinthine or Byzantine, actually, the system has become. And
all right, I've really got to ask you, I've got to stop you and ask you, look, I don't talk to people every day like you. And number two, I definitely don't talk to people every day who briefed a CIA director of Clinton's, I believe, on the kinds of things that you're talking about right now. I would love to hear what that meeting was like. Can you talk about it? I mean, really?
Well, I can, and it was very upsetting, actually, for me. And, people who don't know who I am, I'm a emergency and trauma doctor. So, I've gone from one level of trauma to real trauma. I tell people taking care of, gunshot wounds and head-on collisions and people's heart attacks was so much easier than this stuff. And what I learned, you have to imagine, I'm a guy in my 30s. I'm working full-time, running an emergency department. I have 4 young kids. I'm shuttling up to Washington doing this, frankly, crazy stuff. And it was very, very stressful. And so one of the most disturbing parts of this meeting, which, of course, I thought it would be, usually when you're with someone who's a cabinet-level person, it's 20 minutes, it's 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. This went on for nearly 3 hours, Art.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there with this man, and, of course, in the house we're in is surrounded by Secret Service folks, which, of course, my naivete back then, I thought we were just going to have dinner and that'd be it. Of course, these guys are all over the place. And what happened is that initially I came in there with a briefcase chock full of what you just asked for: photographs, videotapes, government documents, transcripts of these testimonies from people who've been on the inside and seen this stuff. And after about 10 minutes, the CIA director said, Woolsey said to me, I know these exist. And it turns out that he and his wife had seen one back years ago when they lived up in New Hampshire. So the thing that he was most interested in, and he looked straight at me, straight in the eyes, and he said, Dr. Greer, what I want to know is why it is being kept this secret, and
this
why.
This is the CIA director asking you why it's being kept secret.
Yes, because he was being lied to, and so was the president. So later, I did meet a guy in the science director at the CIA, who I don't want to name, but who I've been in touch with for a couple decades now, and who I've met with very recently, who did go in and provide some mop-up information for Bill Clinton. But at that time, what I wouldn't have believed, and which most people have a hard time understanding. I know not long ago I was meeting with some senior French Air Force and intelligence officials who were in charge of briefing the president of France on this material, and they came to my condo in D.C. and then out here to my farm near the University of Virginia, and we were having this long discussion, and they said, we can't imagine that people at that level of your government would be deceived on this sort of information. I said, well, it happens every day. I said, what you have to understand is that the black budget of the United States is between $100 and $200 billion a year. In other words, we can't keep track of more money than the largest defense budget of any other country in the world, and that includes Russia or China or Great Britain or France. So I said, you have to understand it's through the looking glass here. And so that was my coming of age. And so the meeting with the CIA director proceeded from what I thought was going to be an evidential discovery, a learning process, and sharing what I had collected, to sort of an exploration of how really dysfunctional the system has become and how dangerously out of control this is.
Well, if he had not heard these things previously, then my impression would be that a CIA director worth his salt would be angry that he didn't have this from other sources.
Well, he was furious. And I have to say, by the end of the night, I had prepared a document, which is actually in my first book, it was available on our website, SeriousDisclosure.com. And it was basically a white paper with a list of suggestions and executive orders and things that the president should do. And I put something like this together also for President Obama when he came in at the request of some of his friends. And what I found was that at the end of the meeting, we're getting ready to leave. It's been a very long night, and went much longer than I thought it would be, and I had to get back down to my hospital. And I'm holding this document. My hands are almost shaking. They are shaking. And I'm this young guy, meeting with this very powerful CIA director. And I look at him and I said, here's some recommendations of what you can do to help get this information disclosed, and more importantly, get the technologies under control so we can bring them out to replace oil and gas and coal. And he looked me square in the eye and he said, Dr. Greer, how do we disclose that which we have no operational control over? We don't have access to this material. And it was this chilling moment where you're sitting with some, ostensibly, it's like you kind of realize the emperor has no clothes. And it's a very sobering, sad moment. And at the same time, it was a little bit farcical because I knew at this point that the man was not making this up. And then subsequently, I don't talk about this much, but it's the water's passed under the bridge enough. I feel I can say these people are out of office. But I had a very similar meeting with the General Patrick Hughes, who was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, for the listeners out there who don't know what that is, that's like the CIA within the Pentagon. It was the part of the Pentagon hit on 9/11, by the way, when Rumsfeld ran out and was helping people. And the general, who was head of the DIA at the time, who was a 3-star, invited me and one of my military advisors to come and brief him. And, he turned to me and he went over to the shelf, his bookshelf, and he said, this was within the first 10 minutes of the meeting, and he said, Dr. Greer, he says, the only thing I've gotten from channels within the Defense Intelligence Agency on this is this. And it was a little like a doll of an E.T. toy doll that someone had given him as a gag gift. Now, this is the general in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And he says, what in the hell is going on? He asked me the same thing that the CIA director, Woolsey, asked me. I said, well, General, you're in good company. This happens quite often. There are people on your staff who are permanently in the DIA who know about this, but they're just not giving you this information because they don't feel that you're going to be here long enough to need to know this. And there was a colonel sitting at that table who stiffened, and his body language said to both me and my military advisor, that guy knew and was lying to the old man, to the general. So this kind of game is played a lot. I mean, is it constitutional? No. Is it legal? No. But it really is how Washington works, quote unquote, or doesn't work, which is why we're in the mess we're in. And I think that this is, another story. Do you remember Gordon Cooper, the astronaut?
Of course.
Well, here's a great story for your folks who are new to this. Gordon Cooper, you can Google him. He was one of the early Mercury astronauts, and he was one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, and we have him on videotape up on our website. And he, back before he was an astronaut, I think at the time he was a colonel at Edwards Air Force Base, where Edwards Air Force Base is. And this is 1956, so this is a long time ago, 50-some years ago. And he was there when, in broad daylight, one of these objects landed on a dry lake bed. Now, it was his team, his reconnaissance team, and people who reported to him who actually went out there, and they filmed this. It was an old, of course, real movie footage, not digital. And they brought
Do you know that Gordon Cooper told me the story you're relating right now?
Yeah.
I interviewed him. Hell of a story. Keep going.
Well,
keep going.
So, but the part you don't know is something that's going to blow your socks off. Okay, so he puts this together, looks at it, it's developed, he looks at the film, and it's authentic, and there's this object in broad daylight. It is flown back on a general's plane to the Pentagon.
That's right.
All right. And there's a whole lot of back and forth and detail I'm not going to waste time with, but the bottom line is, fast forward to a few years before Gordon Cooper passed away. And he and I are given addresses to the Federalist Society, which is a pretty conservative group in Washington, who had invited him and me to address them on the UFO issue. And I'm talking to him before I give my presentation. And Gordon Cooper, my wife is with me, looks at me and he says, the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, asked me about this because he wanted to be able to go and retrieve that footage, because Cohen, of course, believed Gordon Cooper. He knew that Gordon Cooper would not make this up, and that he had what's called actionable intelligence. The date,
of course he didn't make it up.
Okay, so here's what happens, is that the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America gets all this information directly, which I had gotten also from this American hero, Gordon Cooper. He begins to dig into this, into the Pentagon, and comes up, and he finds out that all of that material is out of his reach, and it is in the Black Pit of Calcutta. So basically, here you have a Secretary of Defense who is making directed inquiries on a specific incident with
Yes.
material and actual intelligence from a U.S. astronaut, an early U.S. astronaut, and he can't get nothing. So Gordon Cooper tells me this story, and I think Gordon Cooper thought I'd be shocked, and I said, oh, no, this is what I would expect to have happen.
Gordon told me that the pictures just disappeared, Doctor.
They went into these parallel universe program of the so-called black world. And actually, the proper name, to just educate your listeners, and some of them listening may have heard this, I actually met a man in Washington recently who had heard the term and didn't know what it meant. And they're called USAPs, USAP, Unacknowledged Special Access Projects. Now, everybody knows what a special access project is. It's the U part. It's the unacknowledged part. And the way those work is that, let's say, I'm a colonel and you are the Secretary of Defense. Well, obviously you outrank me. You're the civilian boss of the Pentagon. But if I'm in an unacknowledged special access project, a USAP, I am instructed that no one outside that compartment is ever to know anything about it because it is completely unacknowledged, off the books, and black. And that if I am ordered to give information on it, I am to respond that to whoever it is, sir, no such project exists. It doesn't matter if you're the president. Now, a member of my team was in a $3 billion unacknowledged special access project. This is one project. And the admiral that he reported to had all the men who were in that project go into a SCIF, a secure communication intelligence facility underground. And they had all their weapons taken away, all their electronics. And there was one man who went down there with a firearm. And he said, gentlemen, and he took a bullet out of the gun, and he said, there's a bullet with your name on it. And if you disclose to anyone outside this compartment of the existence of this project, this bullet will find you. Now, I'm telling you virtually word for word what this military, fairly senior military guy who's been on my team for many, many years told me. And so this is the kind of spooky nonsense that goes on. And with that kind of compartment and unacknowledged status, they can get away with a lot. One of the things we came out with a couple of months ago, or maybe 4 or 5 months ago now, is a movie called Sirius, ironically. Here we are on Sirius XM. And it was the largest crowd-funded documentary in history, by the way. But part of what's in there, anyone who wants to see it can see it on our site at SiriusDisclosure.com. In there's a clip of Donald Rumsfeld, the day before 9/11, ironically, at the Pentagon stating, and I'm quoting, there's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for in the Department of Defense over the last few years. Trillion, not billion. So this is the missing $2.3 trillion, but that's 12 years ago. So now it's probably 3 or 4 trillion. And it's going into these kinds of projects. And this is what the American public has no idea about. They think that the budget debates that we're having are legitimate discussions. I'm going, oh, no. I mean, you've got $4 trillion missing.
Okay, Doctor, a quick question for you, and then we've got to go to a quick break. And
sure.
The question is, yes, you had a really good career as an emergency room physician. Weren't you back then, back in your 30s, weren't you scared to death that you were going to, drive a sword right through your career?
Well, no, because I had established myself as someone in the community as a really good doctor, and had become chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine. And people knew, even though they were a little perplexed at why I got involved with all this. And as you know, my uncle was a senior project engineer that worked on designing the lunar module that put the first man on the moon at Grumman, right, which became Northrop Grumman. So I had a knowledge and an interest in this since I was 8 or 9 years of age. But I think that, it really didn't hurt. I was worried it might, but luckily, people knew me and my skills as a doctor first before. Now, I think, be honest with you, if I had gotten involved in this subject before I had gotten established in medicine, it would have been a major problem. But
so it's kind of like you had tenure. Hold on, we're going to take a break here very quickly, and we'll come right back.
Sure.
Boy, talk about a guest that you just sort of have to point at, and they take off and go. This is one of them. But listen very closely, because what this man is telling you is the complete truth, beginning to end. So if you, I don't know, were agnostic about it or a non-believer, then listen carefully, because some of what he's going to tell you is going to definitely blow your mind. A word about C. Crane, my favorite electronics company in the world. This is about their FM transmitter. Transmit any audio, don't care what it is, to any nearby radio. It's their FM transmitter, folks. You can set the frequency and you're on the air. It connects to your satellite radio, iPhone, iPad, iPod, smartphone, computer, internet radio, doesn't matter, or MP3 player. Uses a common 1/8-inch stereo jack. Transmits clean, very near broadcast quality stereo audio. This thing is cool, my pirate friends. Rated to transmit up to 45 feet line of sight, but you have to remember not to attach a 30-inch wire for more distance. Powered by included AC adapter, and also runs on a couple AA batteries. Full frequency coverage from 88.3 megahertz to 107.7 megahertz. In other words, the whole FM band. Portable, fits in the palm of your hand. Only $59.95. Man, this thing is awesome. Call C. Crane, and you can call them right now and get one on the way. How much was that again? How much? $59.95 for an FM stereo transmitter? Yeah, right. Call C. Crane at 800-522-8863. You can call right now. You can even get a catalog if you want it, but the transmitter, there are tricks. I mean, check the internet, folks. The FM transmitter, 1-800-522-8863. You can call right now. Greer doesn't take a lot of questions, so nor does he take many pauses. It's absolutely amazing, actually. Dr. Greer, welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah.
You really can go almost without taking a breath. I've been sitting here amazed at that.
Oh, well, I'm just sharing the sort of like the tips of the iceberg that I know.
Yeah, when you get going. In terms of, our government has told us, way back after Roswell, that, among other things, UFOs are no threat militarily to the United States. Now, they've said that, and of course that they're just not real. There is no documented cases, and that's bull. We just finished talking about a U.S. astronaut who watched one land, took photographs of it that went into a black hole somewhere, and there's a lot more stories, and these stories are real, aren't they? In other words,
oh sure, they're backed up with documents and with radar traces and everything else. So it's like, I often get asked, hey, where's the beef? Where's the evidence? I said, well,
right.
It's there. The fact that you haven't seen it those are two separate issues. And by the way, a lot of the people that I've met with in the government who are pranced out to tell people, oh, well, this isn't true and we know nothing of this. They're actually telling the truth from their perspective. In other words,
sure.
They honestly don't know anything about it. And when they make an inquiry through this massive, huge, complex system that's built up since World War II, they can't penetrate into the secrecy. And so when they report out to the public, I mean, this is where you get into this whole concept of plausible deniability. They would pass a lie detector test, and they're not lying. So now, are there some devils out there who do know who've lied in the past? Yes. But for the most part, the people who go out there and say this, who are usually fairly low-level people or people who wouldn't have a need to know, are speaking the truth to the extent they know it.
Okay. What is your view? Our military has said they're not a threat to us. Are they, or are they not, Doctor?
Oh, I think not. I mean, one of the things that I went and did back some years ago, I went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where a lot of the remains of some of these objects that we had targeted with electromagnetic weapons that had been down were sent back in the early days. Now we're talking the post-World War II period and onward. It's not really that key of facility anymore, but Wright-Patterson was way back in those days. And I was asked to have a meeting there with the head of the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center, which had been the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force. And in fact, the man who ordered it was the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff. And I went there, and one of the things that the colonel in charge, Colonel Canola, asked me, he said, well, in your study of this, do you think that they could be a threat to our national security? I said, you're asking the wrong question. Could they be? Yes. Obviously, if you have interstellar travel capability, you're kind of beyond rockets and jets, all right? But are they? The answer is no, because I said, given the galactically stupid things we have done, where we have pursued them and fired on these objects, et cetera, and so forth, if they were hostile, it would have been point, set, match, over. Back about 1945. In other words, about the time we detonated the first atomic weapon at the Trinity site, if this had been the intent of these visitors, it would have been made crystal clear to us. So I'm very skeptical of all the sci-fi and, they're coming to eat us for lunch routine that you hear from folks. But
okay, but there was there not, an instance in which UFOs hovered above a ICBM facility?
Oh, yeah.
And actually began a countdown, started a countdown here in the U.S., and then I believe shut one down in the USSR at that time. And if that's not a threat...
well, no, actually what happened is that they took at least 16 intercontinental ballistic missiles at Minot, North Dakota, offline. And rendered them non-launchable. Now, the same thing was happening in the old Soviet Union. Yes. And the men, we have several of these men who were at the facility in Minot, North Dakota when this happened. Do you
know where I heard that, Doctor? It was on years ago, 2020.
Yes, and actually I met with Sam Donaldson and talked to him about this at ABC News about what they had looked into over in the Soviet Union and what we, by piecing these cases together, and also with Colonel Diedrichson. Colonel Diedrichson, if you go to our website, SeriousDisclosure.com, he's one of our witnesses who was over the old Atomic Energy Commission, that's now the Department of Energy, but his responsibility were all nuclear processing facilities, weapon storage areas in the United States arsenal. And that was his position. And what he and other people I've talked to have said to me is that there was a clear interest by these visitors in these weapons, but not in a hostile way, but a concern that we might end up destroying this whole planet, which for all we know, they may have a long-term interest in that goes back for thousands, perhaps millions of years, and that's another discussion. But obviously, what they were trying to say, and in fact, one of the Captain Sala, who was there at the Minot, North Dakota, when I talked to him about this, he said his feeling about this as this was unfolding with this luminous object outside the silo and with these 16 thermonuclear weapons with multiple warheads, by the way, going offline and being rendered unlaunchable, is that the message he felt they were sending was, if you fools go to mutual assured destruction, we can do something about that, but for God's sakes, don't. In other words, it was sort of a cautionary thing, because let's take two steps, big, long steps back.
Well, maybe that was a message, but listen, the military usually doesn't get subtle messages. I mean, when you shut down their ICBMs, they think big time threat.
Well, they see certainly the capability to render all those little toys pretty useless, and I think from my perspective, good. But from the perspective of someone whose responsibility it is to keep us in a state of readiness to launch those objects, if we had a full thermonuclear exchange during the Cold War, it would have been the end of life on Earth, and everybody knows that with nuclear winter and what have you. But I think that the bigger question is, If those events are true, and they are, and here's the case, and in fact we have the documents, we have multiple independent corroborating witnesses to this case that you've just asked about in the Disclosure Project materials. What was the point? Well, I think the point was, when you piece it together with what was going on in the old Soviet Union and very similar events, is that they were trying to get us to rethink that whole strategy of mutual assured destruction.
What happened in the Soviet Union?
Well, there were multiple events where silos and thermonuclear missiles, intercontinental missiles, were rendered not only unlaunchable, but were actually, in a couple cases where they were testing them, at least the missile part of it, were made to go completely haywire. In fact, there's a case where this was happening, as you know, from Vandenberg Air Force Base. The same thing happened with one of our witnesses for the Disclosure Project, testified that he was there doing all the very high-tech imagery of this launch. And so this is what happened in the Soviet Union. They launched one of these, didn't have an active hot, obviously, a nuclear warhead on it, but they were trying, and they would be intercepted, and basically as they became exo-atmospheric, in other words, just as they're leaving the atmosphere and going to go intercontinental, they're pretty much just taken out, neutralized. And he actually saw this happen. This particular witness from a Vandenberg Air Force Base launch, and after he and Major Flores started talking about this, he was threatened. He had his mailbox blown up. He had all kinds of weird stuff start happening, and weird calls in the middle of the night, cursing at him and what have you. But he stayed, and he's a professor, Jacobs, and he has come forward, and we have his testimony now about that whole event. Well, similar things were happening in the old Soviet Union, and by the way, also with some of the French and British facilities. One of the most compelling and interesting cases that, of course, I spoke at great length with the former head of the Ministry of Defense for Great Britain, Lord Hill Norton, who I spent some time at his home in Hampshire discussing all this. And back in the about 1980, 81, I believe it was, we had at the Rendlesham Forest the Bentwaters case, they call it, the Bentwaters Royal Air Force Base. It was actually more of a U.S. Air Force base. It was both British and U.S., but it was a covert nuclear weapons facility that was not acknowledged to the Soviet Union, and would have caused a huge amount of political problems in Great Britain, and with our talks with the Soviet Union had it been acknowledged. But there were hot thermonuclear weapons there, and it was a ready base, even though it wasn't acknowledged to the public. And for several nights, there were these UFOs seen in the skies near this Air Force base. And then on this one particular night, there was an object that came down and landed out on the edge of the base. And of course, later they tried to debunk it that they just saw a distant lighthouse, and they make up all kinds of absurd stories. But the men who actually were sent out there to see this particular object, it turns out it was a black pyramid-shaped ET craft that, as it landed, it came down and it actually scraped some trees and broke some branches, and then left a perfectly square base landing area with various changes, radiological changes in the soil, that has now been confirmed by the Ministry of Defense of Great Britain. Now, this was denied and lied about for years in the United Kingdom. And interestingly, Lord Hill Norton, who was a five-star admiral, back then they had what they call Sea Lords, and he was the five-star admiral. He was the head of the military committee for NATO, but he was also the Minister of Defense. And in Great Britain, for those who don't know, that also means you're head of MI5 and MI6. It's like our CIA director, all in one position. So I'm sitting here talking to this gentleman, and he's telling me that the entire time he was Minister of Defense, and on the head of the military committee for NATO, he had no knowledge of this subject. It was only afterwards that he began to find out about it. And he was furious, frankly. I'm sitting at this man's house. He's this old, admiral. And he is like hopping mad, I mean, pissed off that here he was sitting on top of the entire defense establishment in Great Britain. There were these sort of events going on kind of under his nose. He had no knowledge of it, and he admitted that to me. And
all right, so I mean, what you're telling me, and have told me again and again in these first segments, is that there is a government, and then there is a group of people who have this information, control this information, and control those who would like to know this information, apparently, in government. In other words, we have a government within or beyond a government, correct?
Right, and this is precisely what Eisenhower was warning about. When Eisenhower said, "Beware the military-industrial complex," I mean, he was a five-star general, World War II hero. He was not anti-military. He was opposed to this out-of-control aspect of it. That, and I'm not criticizing Eisenhower, but this whole mess got out of control on his watch between 1953 and 1961. That's when.
All right, Doctor, why not disclosure? In other words, with the shape the world's in right now, not that hot, frankly.
Right.
It seems to me that disclosure, if done correctly,
right,
would just lift all boats. And,
yeah. No, not all boats. Now let me stop you right
most
there, right?
Boats. How about that?
Yeah, 99.99999% of humanity's boats would be lifted. The 0.00001, forget the 1%. We're talking about the uber elite. And actually, at this meeting I was attending a couple weeks ago with all these leaders from around the world, and you had people there from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and all kinds of folks. And what the discussion, the title of the entire conference weekend was From Disruption Opportunity, and I was there to present the case for disrupting the current status quo of terminating the oil, gas, and coal industries over the next 10 to 20 years and bringing these sciences out that would explain how UFOs are moving. Now, the reason for the secrecy in the early days, I mean, let's go to ancient times, 40s, 50s, 60s. A, they didn't know what they were dealing with. B, they were trying to figure out how these objects moved. Going, for example, the head of the Belgian Air Force, General de Brouwer, when we went to Belgium, and here he's talking about the fact that in Belgium they had these massive triangular ships that were about 800 feet on each side, that were going from completely still and hovering to several thousand miles per hour straight up against gravity and making right-hand turns outside the envelope of any normal aerodynamics of a jet or a rocket or anything else. And I have a quote, actually, on our website from him talking about this, and we actually have a radar tape of that event from Belgium. So what's interesting is that, obviously, these objects aren't using Exxon Jet A fuel. They're not using oil. They're not using normal rockets and things of this sort. And so the technology and the physics, and this is the part of this that I actually was the hardest part to kind of get through the head of the policy people at this meeting, is that the secrecy has nothing to do with ETs, and it has nothing to do with the fact that people are going to hurl themselves off the Brooklyn Bridge if there's intelligent life out there. I mean, more than half the public believes there's life out there already. You're
going to tell me it's energy.
It's about money and power and energy. So, let's cut to the chase here. These UFOs are not operating using the internal combustion engine that Mercedes invented in 1888 or what have you. All right,
sure
so this is not your granddad's Oldsmobile.
Okay, all right. So there are many different types of propulsion that we can imagine. Here's my next question. Are we actually, Doctor, aware of operational details of propulsion systems that could be applied to U.S. and world energy needs?
Yes, and what's interesting in a document that was released accidentally in Canada that dates from 1951. Now, this is before I was a twinkle in my father's eye, by a man named Wilbur Smith, and it's a top-secret document. He was head of Project Magnet that was studying this issue in Canada. And I'm quoting here, where he says, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist, period. Their modus operandi, meaning their propulsion system, is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. Now, this is an uncontested top-secret document. Who was Vannevar Bush? He was the guy who headed up the Manhattan Project, the mastermind behind it, much more so than Teller and Oppenheimer. So what began in the 40s and 50s, in particular after World War II, was...
It's always a Bush.
Yeah, they're not related, but was a very serious, very, very serious look at how are these objects getting their energy supply, and how are they moving in these non-aerodynamic ways. Now, by October, a man who I've worked with for many years, the senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs, Rick Foch, the third-ranking highest guy at the Naval Research Labs, was in, quote, the vault that has a lot of the documents on this issue. And he was able to confirm to us that in October of 1954, around that date, again, before I was a twinkle in my father's eye, we mastered, quote, gravity control. In other words, the energy and propulsion aspects of these objects were definitively known by October 1954. So for the last 50-some years, our burning oil and gas and coal and using jet engines and all that jazz has just really been an artifice, because it's a multi-trillion, in fact, a multi-hundred trillion dollar asset-based question of what do you do? And yes, most people would benefit from this information, and anyone interested in the future of the Earth and in sustainability and the environment and world poverty and 7 billion people in China and in India, 2.5 billion in China and India, trying to live like you and I do, burning coal for our electricity. Anyone with an IQ greater than mud is going to go, how are we going to keep doing this? We can't. Now, however, if you're one of the masters of the universe at Goldman Sachs, or in these big trading houses with all their enormous wealth that they're trading on the petrodollar system and all these commodities, quote unquote, such as oil and gas and coal and natural gas and centralized utilities and on and on and on. This is not a few billion or a few hundred billion. This is trillions and trillions of dollars in assets that are hanging in the balance. And so it's really the tail is wagging the dog here. And so the secrecy has much more to do with geopolitical power and keeping kind of the status quo as it is. Now, at a certain way back, you could kind of almost understand it, because people didn't understand that we were going to go from having 3 or 4 billion people to 7 billion people, on and on and on. But now in 2013, I would think the secrecy has become an existential threat to our civilization. And this is what the first CIA director was saying when he said that the threat isn't from the UFOs, it's from the secrecy around the subject. And that's what he says.
My IQ is only hovering above mud, but it's there. So I want to ask you, do you have the details on these energy systems? Do you know the answer to this? Do you know what kind of energy we can suddenly begin using, Doctor, that we're not using, that's been held secret? Or do you know who knows?
The answer to both, yes. But, I'm just a country doctor here in Virginia, and I'm not not an engineer. But I do I understand it, and have I seen how these objects work? Yes. In fact, I was in a facility near the Huntsville Space Flight Center in the Redstone Arsenal a few years ago, where I was taken into a place where there were these objects that were hovering and floating around using this type of high voltage system, and it was an ion propulsion. And later, this same system was reproduced at the hangar at the Naval Research Labs there in near Washington, not far from where this shooting just happened yesterday. And the people who were part of that project have spent time at my home, and what they've discussed is that if you take a very high voltage signal system and you put it at a certain resonant frequency, a certain cycles per second, all right? We're not talking about 110 voltage or 220 out of your home outlet, but millions of volts, but at very low current. So you're not using much power. Okay. You can create what's called a Poynting vector. I don't want to get too much into the physics because people fall asleep. But you can create a vector into what's called the zero-point energy field. And you can pull energy out of this so-called zero-point energy field or quantum vacuum that is huge amount of energy. I mean, it's estimated that every cubic centimeter of space in your room where you're sitting would run the United States for a day just because there's so much potential power there. Now, has this been proven and published in physics journals? Yes. Look up the Casimir effect. The Casimir effect decades ago was proven, and it's been reproduced, that this zero-point energy field exists. The question is, have there been any breakthroughs in the application of this theoretical physics?
All right, Doctor, yes, hold it there. We've got to do a break, so relax, take a good deep breath, and we'll be right back.
Sure.
You're listening to Dr. Stephen Greer, CSETI's Dr. Stephen Greer, and of course, Dark Matter. I'm Art. In the meantime, welcome back, Dr. Stephen Greer. I've got I want to describe something to you, Doctor, and it's
sure.
the truth. And you tell me what I've got. I've got an antenna here that I've had for years and years, and it's got a kind of a bunch of interesting stuff about it. For example, it covers 5 acres. It's called a double loop antenna, and it covers 5 acres. The high point is about 100 feet. The lowest it gets is about 76 feet. Now, here's what's special about this antenna. Number one, it creates its own voltage. It creates extremely high voltage,
right.
And even nice, beautiful blue skies, no wind, nothing. It creates enough voltage, Doctor, to knock you right on your butt.
Sure.
And I have no idea where it comes from. Now, it's not a great deal of current, but it is a great deal of voltage and enough current to knock you on your butt. So we're talking about something. For years and years and years, I've wondered what it is we're talking about, and I don't know why that voltage is there, but when you close it and put it to ground, you get a nice, long, blue spark. What
right.
is all that? Yeah,
well,
what is that?
Part of it is that there's an electromagnetic potential associated with the Earth, that there's a certain degree at the level of the ground, and then there's a certain amount as you go upward, even several meters. In fact, that's why loggers will have to have a ground cable when they're scaling a very, very tall tree in the Pacific Northwest, or they can get shocked. So there is a known voltage delta or differential between the ground and as you go upward into the sky, even a few meters, and certainly 100 feet or more. And that is a well-known phenomenon. And can it be harnessed? Yes, it could be. In fact, there are people who discussed how perhaps Nikola Tesla had experimented with some of these unusual antennas and were pulling energy out of this phenomenon. Now, that's, I think, different from what I'm talking about in terms of the quantum vacuum or the so-called zero-point energy field. That is the energy.
Can you explain that? What is zero-point energy? What is it?
Okay, that's the energy that's left in any volume of space if you were to cool everything down to absolute zero, minus 273, whatever it is, absolute, where all atomic movement stops, everything stops. There's still an energy potential there, and this has been proven in physics, and as I mentioned, the Casimir effect. What people don't understand, however, is that for over 100 years, scientists such as Faraday, Nikola Tesla, others, in experimenting with high voltage systems, would create a phenomenon where they would tap into that energy that's in the quantum vacuum, and it would you would end up getting more energy out of, say, a generator than you have to put into it. Now, people say, oh, it's violating the laws of thermodynamics. I said, no, it isn't, because it's pulling energy out that you haven't been calculating is there, but has been proven to be there. So it's energy that's not in outer space. It's in any volume of space. And this is a huge amount of energy, and it's been reported, of course, that Nikola Tesla had an electric car running with an antenna on it, that it recharged itself, and this is true. And in fact, I've got an amazing document. It's on our website where when Nikola Tesla died, the FBI swooped in and confiscated all of his secret papers.
That's right.
And I have a document where the Department of Defense of the United States is demanding that the FBI turn over those files to them, and they wouldn't. And so, you have all these sort of fiefdoms within the government. But,
even to this very day, they won't turn it over.
Right. And so what's interesting about this is that the secrecy around the whole UFO and extraterrestrial issue has so much less to do with what most people would imagine than very ordinary things like power and money and oil and gas. And first of all, let's take a big step back. If you look at the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, okay, we had choo-choo trains, which were basically steam engines, and then you had, the early internal combustion cars that Mercedes had, and then, of course,
right.
Ford. So that's over 100 years old. Then you had electricity from burning coal, creating a steam turbine or hydroelectric. Jet engines, by the way, were the 30s. And rockets, of course, Wernher von Braun, who's chief spokesperson for the last few years of his life, is one of our Disclosure Project witnesses. Wernher von Braun, who was Adolf Hitler's rocket guy, who was inventing V-2 rockets dropping on London, that was the 40s, early 40s. So are we to really believe, and of course the atomic bomb was 1945 at the Trinity site there. Are we really to believe that in 70-some years there have been no breakthroughs in fundamental physics of energy generation and propulsion? Well, that's just nonsense.
You're right. It's very, very hard to believe. There should have been many more breakthroughs in the energy field. And, gee, can we sit here and imagine that, A, there have been, and B, wonder why they just have sort of not drifted to the top?
Well, here's why. Well, there's a number of reasons why, and I want to get into this just a little bit. On our website, at Sirius Disclosure, SIRIUS Disclosure, all one word.com, there's a document from the Federation of American Scientists. Now, since I've spoken to you last, Art, this group of very prestigious scientists in Washington, D.C., came out with from their National Security Project, Stephen Aftergood put out a report, and it was 3 years ago next month in October that this came out. So it's fairly recent, that there are 5,135 patents that have been seized under the National Security Act. Now, one of the things that they bring up, they don't really drill down on the whole zero-point question and anti-gravity question, but they do mention the fact that 40-some years ago in 1971, that there was a photovoltaic generator that was more efficient than 20% efficiency, which was unheard of back then, that would have basically competed with the price point for oil and coal. And it was seized under a national security order. Now, what justifiable reason could there be for the abuse of state power to seize someone's invention that was simply a very super efficient solar electric generator in 1971. This is the kind of abuse of power that has gotten us into this kind of mess that no one is talking about. Now, the Federation of American Scientists, which is not some conspiracy group or something, is a very mainstream group, brought this issue up and asked the question in this document, how could this really be justified under the National Security Act, and how many other wonderful technologies have met this demise? So that's one avenue of what I call suppression. The other avenue is before you even get to filing a patent, you get some goons who knock on your door. And I have I have a man who I had under contract a couple years ago who does a lot of work for the intelligence community and the contracting community, but he had been granted permission to work with us to bring out one of these so-called free energy generators. So, we provided a grant to him so he could do this in his spare time because he was still working full-time for...
I remember this. I remember.
All right. Now, this man... knew how to build something similar to what you're discussing, but much more compact that you have out at your ranch in Nevada, where it would have basically been something you run your house on this electromagnetic potential. And we wanted to bring this out to sort of a demonstration proof of principle project. So sure enough, he starts working on this and assembling, and he knows exactly what to do, by the way. This is someone who's not some wild-eyed inventor who knows nothing. This is a very ingenious inventor.
Okay.
And, about the time he gets rolling on this, a former CIA director and a bunch of goons show up at his skiff, his secure facility, and basically threaten him and his wife and tell him to stop working on it, and he does. And we're out the resources and funds we provided, and this guy runs with his tail between his legs.
All right.
So
listen,
this is something that in a court of law I can prove happened.
Okay, you had money. You had money invested, Doctor. You had money invested, right? I remember. Well, I remember when you raised that money. Sure. I remember. Now, since it got squashed and since he got threatened, I'm sure you have the exact details, don't you, of what was said to him and how it was done?
Oh, sure. And in fact, the people at the Naval Research Labs who brokered the relationship with this gentleman were appalled and shocked at how this was all played out. And
how did it play out? I'm asking you exactly how did it play out?
Well, after he was really making some progress on a deliverable date, he got a visit from a former CIA director who, ironically, had at one point become the chief counsel for Booz Allen Hamilton, the big contractor that Snowden worked for. And he went down there and basically, with some other folks, threatened this guy. And it said all kinds of things that scared him to the point of stopping doing this. And what I've concluded, here's the problem, the lone wolf approach, and this is all we've had resources to do. We're trying to raise more funds to create a stronger research effort now, is that we would provide, maybe $100,000 to some of a modest grant so that they could work on something and get something put together. But they're working by themselves, and they're out there as lone wolves who don't have any kind of tactical security. They don't have any kind of support system, and it's inherently risky. So I'm not going to ever do that again, frankly.
Did they actually threaten his life?
Oh, yes, and his wife. His life and his wife.
God.
Now, it's interesting because the man who first introduced me to him is a very senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs, which is the largest Department of Defense lab in the world, by the way. Thomas Edison founded it. It's interesting history. But he told me that he was involved in an operation where he had learned of some things where he was told point blank that if he were to discuss it publicly, they would kill him, his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. Now, this is not some conspiracy movie. This is someone who slept at my home, who is a very senior scientist in the government. I mean, it's the highest civilian rank. And this is the kind of thuggish nonsense that does go on. And I think the public needs to know about it, and the public needs to say, we're fed up with this foolishness.
Well, of course. I'm curious. Did this impress you to the point that I think you just said it, you would not do it again? In other words, if somebody came to you and said, look, I've really got this, I can demonstrate it for you, I can show you, there's more out than in, it's free energy, whatever you want to call it, I need $100,000 to develop it, what would you say?
I would say no. I would say and I could write that check tomorrow, no problem. I would say, if you have something, go and create it and bring it to me, and we will replicate it. But in terms of doing it this other way, we tried that. We actually, I think over the years, maybe put $800,000 or $900,000 into those sort of efforts with various folks.
Wow.
Not a lot of money. I mean, as R&D programs go. I mean, hell, my ER had a $20 million budget for, an ER in one town. But I tell people that, this approach is inherently risky, but we did it because that's all the resources we had. Now I've concluded what we really need to do is create a research and development lab where these brilliant geniuses can be brought together and they can be supported and protected and work. And you know what? We'll do something we couldn't have done a few years ago. We'll stream it live on Ustream and dare someone to come in here and threaten these folks. And I think the other mistake that many of these inventors have made is that they've tried to go the intellectual property route with venture capital or through the patent system. Because if you go that route, basically, they're going to get it or you're a dead man walking. So I think the only way to do it is that you create it and then you dump it into the Internet. You have multiple academic centers, which we've already identified, by the way, reproduce it independently, and you get it out there and you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube quickly and forcefully. I think any other approach, if you look at the history of this, Dr. Tom Bearden, who's also lieutenant colonel in the Army, I was at his home discussing this, and he lives there in Huntsville near the Marshall Space Flight Center, and he and I discussed this for days. And he said basically the mistakes that have been made, there's a set number of them that you can sort of look over the last few decades and see that one inventor after another has made. The big mistake is that people think that they're going to beat someone in the secrecy game. They're not. These guys know everything, everyone. I don't care if you're in the jungle of the Amazon. They're going to know what you're doing and what you got. So you need to be able to have a system, which we have, where you can get it out to the public very quickly. But if you try to sit on it in a secret way and try to make it a intellectual property battle or a patent issue, you're never going to succeed. You're going to lose because you're going to enter into a system that is gamed against you. So I tell people that if they want to do this, they need to learn from history or we're going to be doomed to repeat it. And
from my own part, if somebody set a bullet on the table and said, this bullet has your name on it, I'm being honest here, that would do it. I mean, that would do it. I've got a family. So folks, think of it yourself. If you had this information in your hand and it was going to help the world, it was going to help the country, it's going to help everybody, but they're saying they're going to kill you and they're going to kill your family, what would you do? I think the answer is pretty clear. You'd probably end up buckling.
Well, and that's why you can't do it that way. This is why you have to have a large number of people. You need to have it all being done and watched publicly in real time. And that's what I've concluded over the last decade of looking into this. And I think that that's a very unconventional way. Now, of course, when you go to Silicon Valley and tell a venture capital that, their eyes roll back because they're all about the secrecy of the next iPhone, whatever.
Sure.
So, and I tell them, look, you can do that with something that's trivial and unimportant, like the products coming out of Cupertino for Apple. I mean, those things don't do anything. I mean, yes, you can talk on them, and they're cool, and they look nice, but they're made in a slave factory in China, so who cares? They're not.
Yeah, but you hardly ever hear of leaks. I mean, never.
Yeah, of course. But,
an apple gets left in a bar somewhere, but beyond that, there's a bullet. There's a bullet on the table with your name.
Is that, for all our vaunted technology, and this is one of the things I was talking with a lot of these folks about at this meeting out in this island in the Pacific, is that, yes, we have some cool communication devices and smartphones and computers, but guess what? We're plugging them into a coal-fired power grid that is this creaky thing that is from the late 1800s and early 1900s in terms of its concept. So I said, we're on the one hand, we have one foot sort of in the future with the internet and all these electronics, but most of our balance is tilted into this early industrial age fossil fuel world that really should have run its course many, many decades ago. And
but
so
it hasn't. It hasn't.
And the problem is that you have so many powerful vested interests that don't want to see that change happen. And it becomes a really easy thing to understand once you understand that it's a massive amount of geopolitical power behind the current system. I mean, even the whole Middle East situation, Art. I mean, we use the buzzword in Washington of our vital national security interests. That's what you hear over. It's a mantra. Well, what that really means is oil. OIL. I mean, what's over there? I mean, date palms and goats and what?
I know. I agree with you. It's oil.
I mean, and there's Israel, but Israel has 300 nuclear weapons. Believe me, they can take care of themselves.
Right. All right, so it's oil. I do agree with that, and I do agree that there would be so much interest in keeping oil and the money from oil to ourselves. Not that we do. We ship a lot of it to our enemies. But there's so much serious interest in oil revenue continuing as it has been that I'm sure that people's lives wouldn't be much. I mean, if they got in the way, then there's a bullet with your name on it.
Well, and this is the whole thing that they discovered with, Gore Vidal wrote the foreword to this book years ago called Into the Buzzsaw, where they studied various journalists who started to drill down on some really sensitive things. And they would either be fired or they would disappear or they died mysteriously. It's a fantastic book. It's actually a mainstream book. And what you find when you look into this is that this is an issue that's much bigger than INSCOM or any of the things that led to those sort of events happening that Gore Vidal was talking about. And I think that now we're talking about it isn't just money and oil, it's the macroeconomic system, and that would change. Imagine if every village or home or business had its own so-called zero point or quantum vacuum generator that would pull energy out of suddenly you have all of India and China and the developing world, so what used to be called the third world, being able to be lifted up out of poverty. But what would happen is that there would be a relative diminution, a reduction in the centralized power of the current world system. And so this is really what it's about. I remember years ago, the admiral in charge of CONUS, Continental United States Security, told our military team and the people who worked with me for years trying to walk me through this system that his job was really maintaining the status quo of the world energy supply. Okay, let me play devil's advocate for just a second and say, all right, Doctor, let's imagine for a second that that this switch did occur. What if I were to suggest to you that the economic disruption from suddenly cutting the oil spigot, no longer needing oil, would be so great that the economic collapse we just went through would be child's play? I'm just playing devil's advocate, but I'm sure there are people who believe that, right? Oh, there are, and I think that there's some merit to that, and I'm not going to disagree with the fact that had these technologies been transitioned in 80 years ago, we wouldn't be in the jackpot we're in now. But what are we going to wait for? Both polar ice caps to melt and for us to go to World War III in the South China Sea over oil? I mean, at a certain point, we're going to have to decide to transition out of the 1800s to early 1900s industrial era into the future. Now,
well, maybe, but I am telling you right now. Before you go on, just before you go on, Doctor, you're talking about, for example, the Spratly Islands, which are near the Philippines. Let me tell you something.
Right.
The United States right now is putting naval and air forces, or about to, back in the Philippines. So,
I know that.
Yeah, so what do you think they imagine is going to happen? I think they imagine that if necessary, we're going to protect the Spratlys, by God.
Right, and I think this gets into the question also of what they're discovering in the oil reserves that are there, in the South China Sea and other areas that are that are falling already into dispute. And this is a problem that's going to just go on and on and on unless we deal with it. The other point I make is it isn't as if someone's going to come out with one of these technologies and they're going to wave a magic wand, and your car and my car are going to have an engine different from what's in it. It's about a 15-year turnover time on heavy, and not an iPhone or a smartphone, but when you're talking about someone's engine or someone's electric power grid, you're not going to do that. You're not going to turn that massive ship on a dime. You're turning a massive super tanker that takes 5 miles to turn around. So I think that when you look at that, there's about a 15 to 20-year period of transition that we have if that technology were to come out today. And I think that if it's done in an intelligent way, I think if it's done in a way that allows for a soft landing out of the fossil fuel economy into this new high-tech sector, and this was my argument that I had all these leaders.
Yeah, but I don't know how you do that. Hold on, Doctor. We're going to take a break here, and then we'll talk about a soft landing.
Right.
I can't imagine a soft landing. He's talking about an economic soft landing. In other words, if something came out that essentially was free energy, 0 point, whatever you want to call it. And it got out, and you could have a little black box. This is just sort of my imagination, a little black box in the back of your home, and it would take care of all your energy needs. There's no way that I see a soft landing there, and if there is, when we get back, we'll let the doctor describe it to us, but I just can't. That's a hard landing. How would you like to boost your Wi-Fi signal at home, in your truck, or in your RV? And when I say boost, I'm not talking about a trivial amount. The Super USB Wi-Fi Antenna 3, invented by the Seacrane Company, doesn't just improve it, it drives it through the roof. It'll improve the Wi-Fi signal on your computer. Users can receive signals hundreds of feet away or more, depending on how you place it. It's an amazing device. It'll increase signal bars on your computer. It works indoors or outdoors. If you put it outdoors, it really cranks. Water resistant. Plugs right into your computer's USB port. That's it. Installation is snap, and performance will blow your mind. Easy to install software is included. As I mentioned, comes with a 15-foot USB cable. So if you can get it to a window, suction cup to the window, and if there's any free Wi-Fi out there, you're about to get it. I'm telling you, this thing cranks. Call Seacrane right now and order one. It's only $99.95. It's worth every penny. I use them. I've got one in the RV, one in the house. They're mind-blowing, really. Call Seacrane right now at 800-522-8863. That's 800-522-8863. Grab a catalog if you like. Oh, listen to this bumper music. I've heard this. I know I've heard this. Anyway, we'll be back in a moment. I think that most of our wars have been about oil, right? And what are we supposed to beware of? What was that? The military-industrial, what was it? Complex, that's it. Military-industrial complex. So if we have free energy, then we don't need oil, and we can't have any wars anymore. Those are about something else, and they're always about oil, so I don't know. I'm confused. I don't see, Doctor, how we're going to come out of this, and you're welcome to explain, with a soft landing, but go right ahead.
Well, it's relative. I'm comparing this transition or soft landing to a sort of an existential terminus where we run up, where it's Mad Max under the Thunderdome. We're fighting over the last barrel of oil, and we have both polar ice caps have disappeared, and vast areas of the land masses are underwater, et cetera, and so on. So, which is going to be harder? I mean, if we came together as a people and said, look, this is something we need to disclose the fact we're not alone in the universe. We need to figure out how to make peaceful contact with these civilizations. We haven't talked about that. And we have to figure out how to bring these technologies that have been bottled up for so long, that are at the root of the secrecy behind UFOs, out in a way that is as least disruptive as possible. Now, my view on this, and this is something which, of course, people would disagree with me on, is that we have to do it because it's the only possible out. I mean, my farm here in Virginia runs on solar, but it's not a practical solution for the average person because it's enormously expensive. It's the largest private solar farm in Virginia.
I do the same thing here. I know, very expensive.
Yeah, and so, but I'm trying to walk the walk to the extent I can. But I think that if you're looking at the planet and you're looking strategically down the road, not the next quarterly return report at Goldman Sachs, but I'm looking, 5, 10, 20, 30 years down, that if we began to bring this information and technology out in a way that focused on the energy generation component and not the propulsive part. But by propulsion, I'm talking about the anti-grav stuff.
Oh,
Because,
yes.
all right, so now this gets into this whole controversy. I had a meeting a couple years ago in Washington, and the head of what was euphemistically called the Future Technologies of the Air Force, this colonel, which means technologies they already have. And he got into this discussion with me about the weaponization of these delivery systems where you're going very, very fast using this kind of gravity-controlled technology that we have in classified projects. By the way, a lot of the so-called UFOs that people see zipping around near Edwards and Nellis Air Force Base, so-called Area 51, are actually, and up there in Provo at the Dugway Proving Grounds, those are actually man-made EMGs, electromagnetic gravitic.
By the way, Doctor, were you shocked beyond belief when the government recently said Area 51 is real?
Well, no, because they said, no, it's real, but at the same time, they said, of course, nothing in that critical is going on there, and it's just conventional stuff. But,
Yeah.
you know, by the way, the area that you're concerned about at that facility is Pahoot Mesa and Groom Lake, and S4, S9, S12, and the really state-of-the-art facilities, like I said, are up in Utah outside of Provo at the Dugway Proving Grounds. And
I've heard that, but who knows what to believe? I mean, both areas are, well, let's put it
I
this
have
way.
folks who've been in
You
these
can't go
places.
visit.
Well, no, you can. In fact,
No.
there are no roads into this particular area at Dugway, and the airspace over it's restricted and classified. So there you have it.
Have you seen the signs that say lethal force authorized? You don't go past that.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I've been out there, and you don't. And so obviously you get the same thing in the outback of at Pine Gap in Australia. In fact, I'm looking at a fantastic photograph of Pine Gap right now that a guy who worked there just sent to me last week. You know what you find is that there are all these sort of facilities that don't get talked about a lot, and then of course, 40 years after the heyday of Area 51, which was back in the 60s, by the way, the government says, "Oh well, it does exist." Well, yeah, okay. So by the time they acknowledge it, it's probably everything's been moved of any criticality.
Maybe. I don't know.
It's all underground anyway.
There's so many mind games going on that who knows.
It's all underground. Everything important is underground. Nothing's above the surface. If it's important, it's subterranean.
Have you ever, Doctor, had anybody tell you where the beings from the crash at Roswell are they, or were they at 51, or were they sent out to Ohio, or where?
Well, the ones, first of all, there was apparently one that lived, and the most that particular being was moved, from my understanding, to various bases over the years, and I have a witness who actually saw it at Camp Perry in Virginia, believe it or not. So who actually on a deathbed confessional and in the video, which we have, talked about this. But of course, the others being deceased, and I know that subsequently there were a number of kind of Tesla coil type EMP electromagnetic pulse weapons that were developed between 1945 and the 60s that were able to target these vehicles when they would be in this dimension. We can talk about this if you wish, and would be able to hit them. And so at Fort Huachuca, if you go to Arizona and you go to Tombstone, there's a place called Fort Huachuca, which is actually Army Intelligence Headquarters, and there is an underground facility there. A man that's on my team had worked in there, and he reported that there were 9 separate ET craft in various bodies that have been autopsied that were in storage there. So I think it's been dispersed, and over the years it's been in a number of locations.
Okay, move back for a second to a soft landing. I mean, as I mentioned, if there was a little black box at the corner of your house and you had an energy source that would keep you going, keep your house warm and toasty in the winter and cool in the summer and all the rest of it, it would take care of your energy needs. I just don't see how you get a soft landing.
Well, I think it's going to be, as I said, I'm using it relatively soft. I mean, compared to the alternative, which is cataclysmic. But no, I think at this point it's going to be a difficult transition because it's been delayed. The analogy I use is that, you got a leak in your roof and you put it off month after month and year after year, and eventually the whole structure of the house starts to rot and fall in. So, yes, we should have dealt with this issue a long time ago. And I remember sitting, there was an old, you probably remember who this guy was. I don't know if a lot of your listeners will, but Senator Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in the 60s, and he was also an Air Force general, and he knew about this just because he knew some pilots that had encounters with these UFOs at fairly close range. And he was also friends with General Curtis LeMay, who of course, it was back in those days, it was bombing back to the Stone Age LeMay, because he was advocating using nuclear bombs and into China back then. But at any rate, I'm sitting in Barry Goldwater's living room. This is a hilarious story in a way. And Barry Goldwater, and I had an assistant with me, and he had left the Senate, and of course John McCain took his seat. And I'm sitting in Barry Goldwater's living room, and his wife is there. They're in Paradise Valley, there in the Phoenix area. And we start talking about this, and he was, this guy wasn't at all religious, I'll tell you that. He was conservative, but in the libertarian sort of way, and every other word was a cuss word. And I'm sitting in his living room, and he said, Dr. Greer, it was a goddamn mistake then and a goddamn mistake now that any of this was kept secret. And I said, yes, you're right. And we started talking about this. I said, well, what inquiries have you made, Senator? And he said, well, he asked General LeMay to get him into the so-called Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base there back years ago, because he was friends with Curtis LeMay, and he was an Air Force general, and Goldwater was an Air Force general in the Air Force Reserves. And Curtis LeMay turned to him and said, God damn it, Barry, I can't even get into that area anymore. And if you ever ask me about this again, I will see that you are court-martialed out of the Air Force.
I've heard that.
Yeah, now I'm sitting, and this is from Barry Goldwater's lips to my ears, and I have a witness to this. And I asked Senator Goldwater, I said, was Curtis LeMay serious? He said he was serious as a heart attack, and he never inquired about this again.
Do you know there may be a recording of that? There actually may be a recording of that or something very similar. I actually heard it. But again, I've got to drag you right back to this soft landing. If you had zero energy in your hand, Doctor, I mean in your hand,
right?
And you had not yet been presented with a bullet with your name on it.
Well,
how would you how would you introduce it into society in some way that wouldn't crash the economy?
I think that it's, you have to define crash the economy. I think that will there be a big hit on the futures markets for oil and commodities? Yes. But
a monstrous hit.
There'll be a big hit. But at the same time, we're taking a big hit now. I mean, let's get out of our, a Eurocentric and American view for 1 minute and look at the fact that 48% of the population of the world doesn't even have indoor plumbing, doesn't have a pot to pee in, the proverbial pot to pee in.
Right.
So if you look, I mean, in a sense, we're living through an economic catastrophe now. We've just been insulated from it because we've been gobbling up all the fossil fuels and resources for decades. But but in the rest of the world, you have unspeakable poverty in India and China and South America and all over the world. I travel all over the world, and you've seen it.
I do too. I've seen it.
So, I think if we look at this and get out of our own sort of narcissistic, ethnocentric viewpoint, we see that we're actually...
Wait a minute. That's a synonym for exceptionalism, isn't it?
Well, no, I think we can be exceptional in a way that doesn't have to be stupid and narcissistic. And I think this gets into, what does real leadership consist of? By the way, this meeting I was at in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was a leadership conference for all these folks. And I said, here's the leadership that we need. People with the courage to disclose this information, lead the way to bring this out, and figure out how to transition into a new economy. And I said, will it be easy? No. But, rebuilding after World War II wasn't easy. And so I think that it's a question of not only does it have to happen, because the alternative is cataclysmic in my view, but it needs to happen the sooner the better, because the longer we put off this transition, the more difficult the landing's going to be. It's going to be harder and harder and harder, not easier. So I think that gets into the problem, is that, instead of, you look in the 1920s, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. Now there are 7. So, and if these technologies had been allowed to begin to come out from the minds of inventors and not been gobbled up by J.P. Morgan and other people, which did happen, we would have had this transition 80 years ago. But we didn't. But now, of course, in every generation of people in power think that, let's kick this can down the road. And this you see a lot with a lot of problems in Washington. Let's kick it down the road and kick it down the road. But now
if we couldn't do it then, which you just told us, and you're allowing that it would be much, much harder to do it now, and that it's infinitely harder now, how are we ever going to get it out?
Well, we have something now that didn't exist 10 years ago, and that is the fact that a huge percentage of the world's population, even people who don't have indoor plumbing, have the internet. And I think that if you get the information and you get the technology out, once you have an operating system that works, it's going to be very hard to stop it. So
maybe what you have to do, Doctor, is get the information, get the schematics, and suddenly just sort of fire it to every news outlet in the whole world and then run like hell.
Yes. Well, if my group could develop something that could get independently tested this way, and where I knew that it wasn't a false alert, we would do exactly that. But more importantly, get it into the hands of a whole lot of different engineers all over the world who reproduce it. And this is why you have to bypass this sort of secrecy, patent avenue, intellectual property route, because that's going to be your Achilles heel. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So let's get it on the record. Do you have that information now?
Well, it's hard for me to say if I have that information. Here's what I will tell you. I have I have a disk with a lot of confiscated patents and information on it that was given to me by someone who was being courted by the CIA. And are any of those systems that would actually work as advertised? I don't know, because A, I'm not an engineer, and B, I don't have a laboratory to put these things to the test. And that's the whole problem. It's a chicken-egg issue. The people who I know who have had some of these systems end up getting intimidated. And now here's a true story that people say it's apocryphal, but it's absolutely true. There's a man that is a physicist who was at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And he had, and I know the CIA doesn't like me to say this, but he had a barium titanate crystal and he had a voltage wire wrapped around it and voltage going into it, and at a certain frequency, resonant frequency, and an output signal that was 10 times more wattage, real power, than the input. Well, in come some goons, and he was not patenting this. He was doing an experiment at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, which is in the Bay Area. And in come these guys. They confiscate his system. They actually take him and put him in a mental hospital and put him on a Thorazine drip and do all kinds of stuff. Now, this man is one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. But, is he going to try to pull this stunt by himself again? No. This is why we're telling people we're trying to put the people together to create an energy research lab where we can do this as safely as we can, but that's being observed on the internet in real time. And I think that's a very different approach to how most people would develop a technology like this. And I actually
the Thorazine says shh.
Yeah, well, the Thorazine just says, he's in a stupor. It's a terrible drug. But yeah, I think that this is how, suppression has happened in a million different ways. And as I look at it, if we're going to make a difference into the future, we're going to have to figure out how to not make these same mistakes over and over again.
Can we?
Yes, I think we can, but we're going to have to pull our resources and involve the public in a very large way. I don't think it can be done, as I said earlier, in a small way at isolated people working on this as lone wolves. This is why what our plan is to put together a research and development laboratory where all this is being done very open and open source, frankly, and put that together with some of the most brilliant engineers and physicists that we've identified over the last 15 years, and make a run at this. And would that be a risky thing to do? Yeah, it'd be a risky thing to do, but I think it's riskier to sit on our hands and do nothing.
All right, you said you had a DVD or a CD or a computer full of many of these type things. Do you think you've got the goods in there? Is it your guess that was yes? Yes.
I think that if we could put together a research team, probably within 12 to 24 months, we'd have an operating system out that would do as what we're discussing. The reason for that is that we've studied so many different breakthroughs that have happened over the years. For example, we've identified the people who worked directly with this guy named Stan Meyer, who had a car that was running on water because he had an electronic system that was actually pulling energy out of the zero-point field so that he could dissociate hydrogen and oxygen out of water and run a car on it. Are
you aware there's a fellow in the Philippines, no joke, who is driving a car around Manila that runs on water?
Well, I've heard of these, and a few of them we've looked into, and they end up not being as advertised. But if that's true, that's great. What I say to people is that it doesn't help if you have one guy running around the Philippines on this. You've got to move it into the mass public. And I think that's, but now, did Stan Meyer actually have that? Yes, but if you look at his patents, he altered the frequencies of the hertz, the cycles per second, and the resonant frequencies, so that no one could do it. Well, of course, the whole point of a patent is to create something that would be protected, and you can put all the information in there. But he didn't. And so when he died, mysteriously and very suddenly, back in 1996, I believe, what he left was a lot of material which we were trying to get, and ended up a big corporation came in and bought it out from under us, from his estate. Now, one of the things he had in there was a toroid. It looks like a donut, and it had a magnetically charged fluid in it, and that was definitely so-called free energy, and it had a national security order on it. But 3 of the people who worked with Stan Meyer are still living. We've identified them, and they would love to work in a research lab like this. So what I've said to people is that a lot of our work has been to collect the information, but more importantly, the people who understand the principles and the physics. Now, how do you put them together in a way that they can, as safely as possible, work on something like this and live to see tomorrow? That's what we're trying to do now at this phase of our project.
Living to see tomorrow. That's good. All right, hold it right there. Here's where we're going to take a break for a moment and a deep breath. Free energy. How would you do it, folks, so that it was a soft landing? That the economy didn't do what it did back in 06 or whatever. So we'd all live happy. I doubt that we're going to take questions for Dr. Greer. He prefers not to, so we'll finish out the hour, and then we'll do on-screen open lines. Anything you want to talk about. Bullets. Names. Bullets with your name or my name. Always worried about that. All right, Doctor, welcome back, and here we go. I'm still not clear on a soft landing. I just don't know how you do this kind of thing. Piecemeal. I just don't get it.
And I don't know. It wouldn't be piecemeal, but maybe soft landing is not the correct term, but I think it's a relative term, as I said, compared to what we're facing if we don't deal with this issue. And
by when?
And I think I think it should have been done decades ago. So as soon as possible is all I can say.
Well, yeah, but if you look at the current oil-based economy, and you look at oil disappearing and getting more expensive, there's going to be a dollar figure. I mean, eventually you're going to be able to pin it to a dollar figure. By the time it's $15 a gallon, $20 a gallon, somewhere in there is a breaking point.
Well, and actually, what would actually happen with this information even coming out on a proof of principle system where it was widely known around the world, is that oil would begin to trend down very steeply because all those markets are anticipatory. All the futures markets and commodity trading market, they would begin to factor that into the value of oil. Right now, the value of oil has a couple of premiums on it. You have the war premium, the chaos in the Middle East, and China industrializing at 8, 10, 12% a year. It's slowing down right now a little bit. It's eased up. But over the long haul, that's the kind of problem we're facing. And I think all this does is build in the likelihood of growing disparities between the wealthy and the unfortunate. And that's a prescription, if you look at history, for revolution and turmoil. So I think the sooner that we can come together as a people to transition out of those systems into something practical, and by practical, I'm not knocking solar and wind. It's just not a very practical, energy-dense solution for a planet with 7 billion people.
No, it's getting better. Here in Nevada and in California, we've got these new solar collectors. I don't know if you've seen them.
Oh, yes.
Very large towers with hundreds and thousands of reflectors pointed at the tower, and they're getting to be fairly efficient.
Yes, but you're talking about that one facility there near the California-Nevada border, costing in the $2 billion range. Well, my God, I mean, the money they put into that, you could have developed these other technologies and begin to have them coming out like sausages off the conveyor belt.
You can throw billions of dollars around, but check out the price of the last war we were in.
Yeah, that was a couple $1 trillion if you factor all the aspects of it in, and
that's a lot of mirrors.
Yeah, it is, and I think that there are solutions, but ultimately they're going to be too little, too late. That's my concern, and I think it's a temporizing strategy to utilize those. I think the real solutions are these ones that have been resisted because they are, in my view, they're transformative. In the view of the conventional wisdom, they're disruptive. And I think that depending on where you're sitting on which side of the fence, it is disruptive. And it's interesting. A few years ago, back when W was the president of the United States, I was meeting with his sort of consigliere on energy and nuclear power, and it was this Harvard law guy, and we're sitting at the University Club there up the street from the White House, and this is a place you see Rumsfeld and all these folks in there, and he's telling me that anybody who becomes president or someone in a very powerful corporate position, no matter whether they're left or right or center or liberal or conservative and all these labels, they don't mean anything. He says basically they get into those positions and they govern and make policies that are very conservative in the traditional sense of not having big change happen. And the reason for that is that they don't want to supervise something this big. This is such a big change. If you add up all the changes that have happened since the 1850s to now, the disclosure of this information would dwarf all of them added together in terms of the way it would change the way we're living on this planet. Now, to me, that's needed, and it's a good thing. It's been forestalled for too long. But if you're in a position where you're just trying to maintain the status quo, you look at the edge, you go to the edge of this precipice, and you're going to go, good God, I'm not taking this leap. So
if they don't act pretty soon, they're going to be supervising billions of people starving to death. They're going to be supervising wars that are going to be so out of control that it'll be the end anyway. So,
well, see, this is what I was saying to you earlier, is that from my perspective, any way you slice it, the wise thing to do is to come together and figure out how to bring out these really advanced technologies and physics in a way that is as non-disruptive as possible. Knowing
I don't know what that is. How about a toy?
Yeah, toy. No. I mean, there's something actually going to run something.
I know, but we're talking about baby steps here.
Yeah.
If you come out with a toy that seems to demonstrate over unity, believe me, people pay attention to that.
Well, actually, there have been there, and actually, there's right now a tritium battery that's exhibiting this. There are a few small, at the level of lighting an LED that are out there right now. But But I think that, it kind of gets lost in the dialogue. And I think to make a change on this, you're going to need to bring out something that the average person is going to see a practical application for it. And I think that is why, getting back to the secrecy and the ridicule of the UFO subject, the secrecy and the ridicule is rooted in the fact that the implications of this are so huge. It's not because it's silly. It's been portrayed silly. I have this really it's sort of a funny CIA document from 1953 it talks about the CIA engaging Disney Studios to make cartoons about ETs and UFOs, so that the subject would be the matter of ridicule and mirth and sort of levity instead of being something serious. And yet you have the first CIA director in this letter that I was quoting from earlier in the show, talking about how people are soberly concerned about this and understand that this is an enormously important issue. And I think that it's because it has so many implications that it has been ridiculed and has been sort of pigeonholed into the silly season of all things ufological, which
Okay. For a second, let's come back to a serious matter, and that is this question: are we currently in any sort of productive dialogue with them?
Well, I can't. Or when you say we who?
We humans.
I suspect yes. Although not on an official level. What I've learned in studying this and leading teams that attempt to make contact, and is that I think individual humans have had contact experiences. Whether the government at some point had some liaison that then fell apart, that's possible. Although I don't see a great deal of evidence for it. The closest I get is from, after meeting with these guys, these French officials, they sent me a letter from a man who was with Eisenhower when apparently he met with some ETs there at Muroc, which is near where Edwards Air Force Base is now, back, I believe, in April of 1956, if my memory serves me correctly. And so apparently there were some attempts to make this sort of more open contact, but it became very dysfunctional because, the motivations for the dialogue were not what they should have been.
All right. Well, we'll probably never really hear about that. What do you know, Doctor, about ET contact that has occurred at the macro level that you consider to be legitimate?
Well, I think it's happened with many individuals who've had contact experiences with these civilizations and the individuals. And what I've done, there's something we started back about 20 years ago called the CE5 Initiative, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, is to train people in the concepts of contact and the concepts of so-called remote viewing and the use of consciousness and other technologies to interface with these civilizations. And when we've done that, we've had some really strange but amazing experiences that have happened. And that's been in every spectrum, photographic, video, electronic, and even, objects and the beings that are very, very close to us. If you look on our website under CE5 on the top header at SeriousDisclosure.com, you can go through that, and there's some photographs that are pretty unusual of what appear to be ET and transdimensional beings that are very near us in places all over the world. So, so what does that constitute contact? I think it does, and I think the question becomes, why are under the CE5 photos and videos at the bottom of that section, you see all these unusual things, like not far from where you live in Joshua Tree, we were having this strange series of experience where we had these electronics set up, and all of a sudden we start getting these signals through all these electronics, and then we see this what looks like a sphere appear in the desert there in the middle of Joshua Tree National Park, and there are about 30, 40 of us there. And this thing floats over and then disappears, and then you start hearing in thin air, there's nothing there, what sound like some people talking. Now, it was in English. And so a member of our team took a camera, and you can see these photographs, and there's this being kind of floating almost in a holographic light area right outside where our chairs were. This is an actual photograph waving at us. And this being has a huge head, has concave areas on the skull, is there, and many people who were there were having other kinds of unusual experiences in consciousness, electronically, and what have you. And I think one of the things that people, when they begin to have this sort of experience, have to understand is if you're dealing with an actual ET, it's going to be strange. Why? Because if they're moving beyond the speed of light from one star system to another, they're dropping out of linear space-time and traversing other dimensions into this point in space and time. So They are all, by definition, a priori, they are all transdimensional or interdimensional and ET. I remember Jacques Vallée and I had this discussion once where he said, well, are they ET or are they interdimensional? I said, well, they're both. I mean, if it was just something like the spirit world or a ghost, they don't need a spacecraft that materializes and lands at Rendlesham Forest Air Force Base.
No, they'd have that ability or they couldn't even get here.
Yeah, so this gets into this whole discussion of a whole new understanding of physics and space and time, where you have enfolded within any, say, volume of 3D, other dimensions that you can traverse through to get from one star system to another. And this is what they're doing. And so when they do appear, it can be very unusual. They can appear and then disappear, or they can be partially in this dimension where it almost looks like a hologram or some translucent circular or disc or triangular shaped object. And in fact, one of the top secret witness guys we just put up from the Air Force was at Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma back years ago, when one of these objects appeared over the hot nuclear area of this Air Force Base, and you could see it. It was like a cobalt blue, but it was translucent. It wasn't fully in this dimension, but it was moving over this area where our planes were loaded with hot nuclear weapons to take off in an emergency. And all the alarms went off. So it was enough in this dimension, and yet it could go straight through. It was not solid, so it could pass straight through these aircraft. And of course, in World War II, everybody knows the group the Foo Fighters. Well, guess where they got their name? Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl got that from, we brought up this information about in World War II there were these objects that were called Foo Fighters that were like that were flying around our aircraft. Hitler thought it was a secret Allied weapon. Mm-hmm. We thought it was a secret Nazi weapon. Now, a member of my team, Dr. Altschuler in Denver, very renowned hematologist, pathologist, wonderful man, passed away of cancer a few years ago. He was General Jimmy Doolittle's nephew. And Jimmy Doolittle, the general, a famous general of World War II, told him, look, I was sent over there by Roosevelt to look into what these Foo Fighters were. And so he goes over there and comes back to the White House and tells President Roosevelt, FDR, that they are, and I'm quoting, they are interplanetary vehicles, but they were behaving in this unusual way. Now, that is a 100% true story. So this is now goes all the way back before Truman to FDR. And these Foo Fighters that were reported in the European theater of operations, I'm sure they must have been seen in Asia as well, were very unusual because sometimes they'd be fully materialized, but often they would be in this form where they're partially in this 3D and partially not, and they would literally come straight through some of our aircraft. And so, of course, I mean, this is the 1940s, and people are completely perplexed. I mean, most people would be perplexed by this today in 2013, but certainly in the 40s they were perplexed. And yet, that's how far back we know that there were these sort of really well-known and high-level military encounters that were getting reported back to the chain of command.
All right, well, let me ask you what everybody asks about this, and that is that, okay, a long, long history of attempts at contact and so forth and so on. So the gigantic question that everybody asks is, if they want contact, then why not the White House lawn or the equivalent thereof and anywhere else in the world? Why not?
Well, it was funny. That's what Larry King asked me, and I said, look, first of all, who's White House? The one in Bogota, Colombia, or the one in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, whatever.
All right, number one. Number two, they'd be blown out of the sky. Number three, I think
no, hold on. How do we blow them out of the sky? They cross dimensions to get here. Surely, one of our hellfires or whatever we're going to use probably isn't going to work.
Well, no, but these electromagnetic weapons do when they're in this dimension, and this is another whole discussion of what kind of covert technologies exist. Everyone assumes that our technologies have stood still, and the most advanced thing we have is a cruise missile. I mean, from the 70s or 80s. I mean, this is nonsense. And I think that the bigger question is, no one can know this for certain, but my reading of this, having gone out for thousands of hours under the skies with people, looking at the stars, looking at objects that come in, is that I think they're waiting for us. I think the ball is in our court. Everyone thinks that somehow they're going to behave the way we might, and that is just come in there and land on the White House lawn. I think that in reality, it's sort of a cosmic Rorschach test, how you view this. And the way I view this is that they're actually waiting for us to awaken to their reality in a way that is peaceful and doesn't create any more chaos than we already have on this planet, number one. And number two, that we approach them in a way that is not militarized and weaponized. And I think, so our approach to it has been all wrong. Now, the larger, I think another question is, a lot of what people are asking for has already happened. There was an event in Montreal, I believe it was 1990, where one of these objects was over downtown Montreal for a very long time and was seen by many people. The events in Belgium in between 1989 and 91, 92, there were tens of thousands of people that would see these objects hovering over cities and over towns and what have you. And it did make it a little bit into the media. And so this gets into another question. Why should they force the issue if we want to be so dysfunctional that we keep lying to each other about this? What is going on? And I think to the extent that we facilitate disclosure, to that extent it is saying to them, to the visitors, that we're ready to acknowledge their presence. So I think that it's more like a cosmic mirror. The way that you respond to this whole issue says more about ourselves or yourself than it does about these civilizations. And I think they're wise enough and patient enough to see if we can begin to get this right.
All right, Doctor, I know you had a number of programs trying to initiate contact, and you did that years ago.
No, we're still doing it.
How productive was it? What did you do?
Well, we still are doing it, and they've been very productive. And that's why I tell people go to the website and go to the CE5 section. They'll see that. And there's a book that we have released not too long ago called Contact, Countdown to Transformation, that goes through all the dozens of events that have happened. And they're like this one in Joshua Tree. Some have amazing photographic and electronic evidence. Others have been very transitory. But what I've concluded from it is that they're willing to make contact with groups of people if people approach them in a way that is peaceful and you're not running around like chickens with your head cut off.
Okay, but after you've got contact, you get productive dialogue. I mean, we're talking about energy here and all kinds of things that they could potentially tell us, which are very, very valuable to the human race. So if you get contact, how do you progress from that to dialogue?
Well, I don't think you're sitting there having a cup of coffee speaking English. I think it happens on a level that's some would call it very metaphysical or paranormal. I don't call it that. In consciousness with remote viewing and at that level. Whether it progresses to another level, we'll see. I think on that level, it's happened to many, many, many people who've been on our teams. And my own experience with this dates back to when I was a teenager, is that it was very highly in that area of the science of consciousness and the understanding of how the mind and consciousness is the ultimate field of energy and non-locality. And they seem to understand that. And so I think that most of the contact that has happened up to this point isn't a sort of a verbal discussion or a sort of translatable language so much as it is on that level.
So you're saying that our consciousness has got to be raised, and we're at some point there'll be a dialogue when we get to their level.
Well, not to their level necessarily, but certainly
close.
where and we have had that dialogue, but it's been on the level of consciousness and remote viewing. And for those of you people who don't know that term, it's the ability to access consciousness in its non-local form and see remote places or remote points in space or time. Now, one of the things that our film deals with, the film Sirius, S-I-R-I-U-S, is that it deals with this question of, is our own individual consciousness, is it actually what we think it is? In other words, we associate it with just our egos and our individualities, but is there an aspect of our consciousness that's operating in sort of a field that isn't bound or limited by space and time? And the answer to that is yes, and the science on it is actually quite clear. You know, Einstein talked about the spooky effect and the spooky phenomenon, where you do something with a proton in one point in space and it's mirrored in another point. They've now discovered mirror neurons. Right. Recently, they found that actually in experiments with rats, that there's precognition and reactions that happen. And on the cellular level, so there's all this sort of phenomenon that has to do with consciousness and the mind.
I think it does as well. I'm convinced that it does.
And the ET contact experiences seem to be where that intersects with these visitors from other star systems. They understand that because, let's face it, you're not going to communicate across multiple light years of space using an electromagnetic signal from AT&T that's traveling at the speed of light. It would take thousands of years to get the signal there and back. So you're dealing. And
if you did, you'd probably get a dropped call.
You'd get a dropped call. So in this case, you're dealing with something that a concept I came up with, which may be too controversial to go into here, back in the 90s, called consciousness-assisted technologies and technology-assisted consciousness. And what I discovered through some experiences I had is that these civilizations have the equivalent of a communication device that interfaces directly with coherent, clear thought from individuals, and that the ETs actually, when they are navigating their craft or communicating, are hooking their own consciousness and thought through these systems that go at what have been called scalar signals that are multiples of the speed of light, but that interface up with thought and consciousness. So it works both ways. There's consciousness assisting the technology, where the individual is interfacing with the technology of the spacecraft or the communication device, but they also have technologies that augment or project their own thought and consciousness. And it works both directions. And in 1991, when I wrote this in a paper, I had a senior aerospace scientist call me from McDonnell Douglas, which is now part of Boeing. He said, "How do you know this?" He says, because they had discovered the same thing in some research they were doing at McDonnell Douglas, because old man McDonald was really into all this. And I said, from an experience I had when I was a teenager with these visitors, that was quite clear to me that they had that ability. And he said, "Well, you're correct." And he said, "But and ultimately this begins to be the bigger question of a paradigm that we're going to go through, this huge shift. It's not just an energy generation and are we alone in the universe, but ultimately it's opening a doorway, I think, into who are we? And, what does it really mean to have the potential of a human being? And I think that potential is amazing because it includes not only the ability to travel interstellar, but to experience states of consciousness that take you through other dimensions. And understanding that in a very clear way, where it becomes scientific and where the scientific evidence builds. And, the physicist Goswami wrote The Self-Aware Universe, and I don't know if you've read that book, but and Edgar Mitchell, who's an astronaut that I've worked with, who founded the Noetic Sciences Institute, and they've done a lot of study on how mind and consciousness and thought are actually not limited by, your brainwave activity or just your body. And that there is this element. I think that's why when you talk about contact with these civilizations, you're going to have to then add in this other area of exploration of the science of consciousness and understanding of a new type of physics that is awareness.
Well, you may be onto something there. You mentioned Edgar Mitchell. I've had him on the show, of course, and maybe you've got some comment on this, but I thought it one of the oddest things, and since you brought up his name, I'll mention it. He walked on the moon, and I got to interview him.
Yes.
And it was an odd interview in the sense that when I asked him to relate his feelings, his mindset, what he thought of, what he saw, what he felt, any senses that he could give to me at all about his experience walking on the moon, he couldn't. He actually couldn't. And I found that disturbing, and I've never gotten over it, Dr. Greer. Have you ever spoken to him about that?
Yeah, I have, but it was in his backyard, and I mean, he explained it as something that was really transformative in consciousness, and where he could, hold up his hand and the whole earth would vanish, and it was a very mind-expanding, a beautiful experience that led him to founding the Noetic Sciences Institute, and so I think that maybe it was, he just wasn't comfortable speaking of it on that level, and on your show, but I'm sure he was very affected by his experience there.
Well, one would think that would be an experience that would be so imprinted that when you're asked for it, the way I asked about it, you would just bubble up with everything that you remembered about it. And I just wanted the easy stuff. What it felt like when you stepped, what things
right.
looked like, what you thought about while you were seeing all of this. And he just really couldn't relate it. Now, maybe it was just that interview in that moment, but it was that question and it was that answer. He said, Art, it's a funny thing. I really can't remember much about it. And I just thought that was amazing.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, what he shared with me was more of this sort of effect it had on him as opposed to any sort of other details. But I do know that when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were there, that there were UFOs that were gathered around the crater where we landed. And this is not a myth. And I've had it confirmed to me by my multiple independent folks. And one of the reasons that Neil Armstrong did not appear in public much is that he did not want to deceive through the secrecy the public on what really happened. He was very uncomfortable with that, and that's why he became kind of reclusive and gave very few public appearances during his lifetime after he landed on the moon in 1969. And I think that Buzz Aldrin, had a hard time coping with it also, and I've had members of his family confirm to me that in fact he had the same experience, but that he wasn't allowed to speak about it. And it's really unfortunate. Ironically, my uncle, who worked at Grumman and worked on the lunar module, passed away 2 weeks after Neil Armstrong did, and but I think it's sort of an open secret in some circles that, in fact, when we first landed on the moon, we weren't alone. And it's certainly known through the Disclosure Project witnesses we have that when we went up there to before the lunar landing, we had something called the Lunar Orbiter that went around and took the early digital photographs.
That's right.
And there were structures there. And Carl Wolf and other people we have in our Disclosure Project, saw at this NSA facility that was at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, these images that were clearly showing very old structures on the moon, but also some newer ones. And the structures were in the area called the Terminator, which is the area between the dark and the light part of the moon. It's sort of the twilight area because the moon is sort of fixed and where it is, where you see the light side, the sun hitting the one side of it. But I think that this is why when we landed on the moon, they were prepared for the possibility or the likelihood that we may not be alone. And people have asked me, did we actually go to the moon? Yes, we did. But was all the footage of what happened shown to the public? Absolutely not. It was not shown. And I do know people who have seen that footage, who've been in these classified programs. They're not willing to come out publicly, but they've described pretty much essentially the same thing, that there were multiple huge UFOs that were flying around, but also around and hovering at the edge of the crater of the Sea of Tranquility where we landed. And
okay, Dr. Greer, you've just about eaten up your 3 hours here, so I think we're going to probably terminate the interview here and go to open lines in a little bit, if that's all right. But you've done a wonderful job. It's sort of point and click. Somebody points at you and you just go, don't you?
Well, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share the information we've gathered. And once again, if folks want to see a lot of this evidence and material and documents and witness testimonies, they can go to SiriusDisclosure.com. It's SIRIUS Disclosure.com. It's there for anyone to see who wants to look at it. And we're always looking for new people to come forward with more evidence and information. So be in touch.
All right. Thank you, my friend, and we'll do it again.
All right. Thank you.